You know what's a great constant throughout history? Satire. Especially for historians, because satire, as a type of comedy, gets its laughs by pointing out the absurdities and inconsistencies in society and exaggerating them to the point that they become comical. This is often done with the intention of bringing some kind of social issue to people's attention by making them laugh about it. So for historians, it's a great tool to get inside the minds of the people of the past. It's a little window into their thoughts, anxieties, and their hopes, etc. And the first really great satirist was the ancient Athenian playwright Aristophanes. Aristophanes wrote Old Comedy, which is very distinct from New Comedy. So New Comedy is what everyone is familiar with because it's timeless. So it's always the story of some young boy or girl who's pining after another young boy or girl, and with the help of their asexual friend/slave, who lives vicariously through them, they eventually overcome the odds and true love conquers all. Rom-coms, basically. The kind of thing that Shakespeare wrote, and the kind that we still write today because, like I say, it is timeless. Whether it's a 21st century American high school or Renaissance Italy, a love story is still a love story and people are going to like it. But that's not what Aristophanes did. Aristophanes wrote Old Comedy, which was deeply rooted in the time and place that it was written in. His plays were kind of musicals with singing and dancing. They were focused around this group of actors called the chorus, and the chorus would basically sing and dance the plot at the audience while all the actors were making puns. And yeah, it's all about recent events, much like a lot of modern day satire is only really funny if you read the news. Aristophanes is only really funny if you're really into the intricacies of late 5th century Athenian public life, which I am. And this means to a modern audience, not all the jokes land, because Aristophanes never explains them. They're always based in things that he just assumes his audience takes for granted. And this is a huge shame because Aristophanes is incredibly clever and tremendously funny. So let's have a look at some of his most famous plays in their historical context. So Aristophanes was born around 445 BCE in Athens, and boy is that a wild time and place to be introduced to the world. So rewinding slightly, in 506 BCE, the Athenian people had started an experiment in their city. A lot of their most recent rulers had kind of sucked, so everyone agreed, hey, from here on out, how about we elect all of our city officials and vote on major decisions? This was called democracy, and very few people were confident that it would work, especially when one of the first things it did was provoke a Persian invasion in 490 BCE. But miraculously, the young democracy survives after defeating the Persians in a battle, despite being really outnumbered. And they vote to build a navy just in time for Persian invasion 2, Electric Boogaloo. So in this invasion, the two big boy cities of Greece team up to beat Persia. But as is always the case, as soon as the wars are over, the allies start squabbling. Sparta and her Peloponnesian friends reckon Persia isn't coming back, and they decide to go home. Athens and her Ionian friends, who live much closer to Persia, decide to form a league to protect themselves. It's called the Delian League, and everyone in it is just the best of friends. And they're all constantly contributing completely voluntarily their soldiers, their ships, and their gold to basically maintain a big navy so that they can see off any potential Persian invasion in the future. But after a few decades and, an official peace treaty being signed with Persia, everyone realizes that the money that they're paying to maintain this big fuck-off navy is basically like dinosaur insurance. It's completely pointless. So a couple of cities decide to leave the League of Allies with a "Thank you very much, Athens. We really do appreciate everything you did with the Persians back there. We still want to remain friends. It's just, we don't really want to be paying all this money for protection when there's nothing left to be scared of." So Athens gives them something to be scared of. They use that big navy that the Allies were paying for to continue to extract tribute and money from the Allies. Whilst at the same time making absolutely sure none of them are thinking of leaving the League. They also grabbed the Allied treasury and moved it from the island of Delos, which was symbolically right in the middle of the Allies, to Athens, which is now very much in charge. And it is during the height of this new order, the Athenian Empire, that Aristophanes is born. Aristophanes also grows up in the shadow of the great Athenian statesman, Pericles. Pericles had dominated the democracy like no other politician had or ever would, being voted in again and again. He did this by increasing the wealth of the city of Athens, very much at the expense of her so-called allies, which they still refer to them as. And he takes a great deal of this wealth and builds the Parthenon, a huge temple complex on the Athenian Acropolis, which had become a testament to the sheer amount of power and prosperity the city had accrued in the last few decades. And it is here, in the centre of the wealthiest city in Greece, that Aristophanes decides he will make his career as a playwright. Not a tragedian like Sophocles or Euripides, though. No, he wants to write comedies. And he's probably going to make a living from this through prize money. So it was at 2 yearly festivals that his plays would be performed. The City Dionysia, a festival to Dionysius, the god of theatre and wine, and the Linnea, which was a smaller festival, but one where comedy wasn't as sidelined by other genres like tragedy, like it was in the Dionysia. So the plays would be shown throughout the day, and at the end of the day some judges would decide the best one, and the writer of that play would get the prize money. It is through this prize money that Aristophanes plans to make his living. And it's as a teenage Aristophanes starts to get his foot in the theatre industry that the peace of Greece is suddenly and rudely interrupted. A number of diplomatic incidents between the Athenian Empire and the League of Allies led by Sparta erupts into an all-out war. It's almost like the lesson of history is that creating two big opposing power blocks with the hope that they will cancel each other out very rarely ends in anything other than a gigantic war. Anyways, fast forward 6 years to 425, and the war is still going on. And it has been so much worse than anyone thought it would be. The Spartans had invaded Attica, and even though they couldn't breach the Athenian walls, they could burn and pillage the countryside, which is precisely what they did. Also, a horrific plague had struck Athens and had decimated the population, killing a lot of the most prominent citizens, including Pericles. This means that the Athenian state is in chaos and is essentially rudderless, having lost, their most influential leader. And it's in this climate that Aristophanes releases the Acharnians. So the Acharnians is about a man called Dicaiopoulos, who is almost certainly a self-insert character for our author Aristophanes himself, and who is completely sick of the war. He is utterly bored of it, but he can't make any progress towards peace, because every time he goes to the Ecclesia, the Athenian Democratic Assembly, and tries to speak about making a peace with Sparta, he's shouted down or forcibly shut up. And so he does a very, very un-Athenian thing, and he withdraws from public life and instead makes a private peace with the Spartans, so that the war will never affect him personally. From the Acharnians, which is his first surviving work, the philosophy of the probably 19 or 20-year-old Aristophanes at this point becomes very clear. There are 3 things that really frustrate him. Firstly, Athenian politics being corrupt. This is a theme throughout all of his plays. Politicians are always shown as evil and greedy, and the people who vote for them are always shown as stupid and easily manipulated. His criticisms of the Athenian democratic system, which remember is a fairly new and experimental one, have led some people to lump him in with the more overtly anti-democratic authors. And this is probably not quite true, but it is the case that the Acharnians, along with the rest of his plays, certainly don't make democracy out to be a particularly enlightened form of government. Secondly, the war between Athens and Sparta. Another theme amongst Aristophanes' work is he is incredibly pro-peace, or more specifically, anti this war, which is kind of unusual of an Athenian of his generation. The younger Athenians at this point in democracy tend to vote very aggressively, very imperialistically. They're quite hawkish, quite pro-war, quite pro-expansion. And thirdly, his own private war with Cleon. Let's start with that. So there's this scene in the Acharnians when Dicaiopoulos, the main character, goes on a little bit of a rant. He starts it with the mantra of satire. What I'm going to say might be unpalatable, but it is the truth. He then goes on to rail about how ridiculous the ongoing war is. But he's also sure to make comments like this. At least Cleon can't smear me with slandering the city in the presence of foreigners. Now I hate the Spartans tremendously, and I hope Poseidon sends them another earthquake. I too have had many of my vines chopped down, but we are all amongst friends here. So why do we keep blaming Sparta? It was some Athenians who started it. Some Athenians, mind you, not Athens. Remember that. Not the city, just some good-for-nothing individuals. Aristophanes is making one of the oldest cases of the few bad apples argument here, but there's some very personal reasons as to why. So, although the Acharnians is Aristophanes' first play to survive, the first play that we actually have here in the 21st century, it wasn't the first play he wrote, it was like his third one. It was his second play, the now lost Babylonians, that caused a little bit of a stir and a little bit of controversy, and it was there that Aristophanes' private war with Cleon seems to have started. Cleon was an Athenian politician who was basically everything that Aristophanes hated. Today we would call him a populist, an imperialist, or a nationalist. All sorts of names. But to the ancient Athenians, he was a demagogue, someone who played on people's emotions in politics. Cleon had been in the audience for this second play, The Babylonians, at the city Dionysia, the huge festival dedicated to wine, partying and theatre that was such a big deal that people from all over Greece and other foreigners all came to visit for it. And this was a problem, because even though the play is lost, we do have a pretty good idea of what happens in one of the scenes. The allies of Athens, the members of its empire, are portrayed as slaves. This is an obvious reference to the already slightly awkward dynamic that the Athenian Empire had, and not to mention it was released just after the island of Lesbos had revolted violently against Athenian rule, so it was a very touchy subject at the time. So, Cleon prosecuted Aristophanes for slandering the city in front of foreigners, or at least that's how it seems. So Aristophanes seems to be using this play as a way of better explaining his criticisms. He might have developed a bit of a reputation as being anti his own state, anti his own country, so he's doing things here like saying, no, I'm not pro-Spartan, I'm not anti-Athenian, I'm just anti the bad Athenians, like Cleon. He also says that I too had vines burned down, which is a clear reference to the Spartan invasions of Attica, where they'd go into Athenian territory, the Athenians would retreat behind their walls, the Spartans couldn't get to them behind the walls, so they would just burn the countryside, something that was very annoying especially to the wealthy landowning elite who got a lot of their money out of agriculture, not out of trade. So in this, Aristophanes is saying, look, I, or the main character, being himself a landed aristocrat, I have lost so much. I have lost things too, but we need to put that aside, forget about revenge, and go for peace. The Acharnians really gets Aristophanes' personal philosophy about the war across very well, and that of Athens. It's 6 years into the war, there's been no tangible gain, and the people of the city are clearly being crushed under the weight of all the losses that they've suffered over the last few years. For example, in the beginning of the play, the Athenians are forced to pay an extortionate amount of money to a group of barbarian mercenaries who are clearly not worth the amount that they're being paid for, which is a direct reference to an actual Thracian king who enjoyed the benefits of alliance with Athens, but failed to really help them when the time came. We see the anger that the Acharnians feel at having their land burned annually by the Spartan invasions. We see the corruption of Athenian politicians who are more interested in securing themselves another year of a cushy job in some eastern court than they are with solving Athens' actual problems. There's also one great bit when Aristophanes ridicules the way that the Greeks make peace. So all Greek peace treaties are basically just armistices. No one is kidding themselves into thinking peace will ever be permanent, so they all have time limits. There's a 10-year peace, the 50-year peace, the 40-year peace, etc., etc. So in the play, peace treaties are symbolized by trying different kinds of wine. There's this bit when Dicaeopolis tries what he calls the 5-year peace wine, a 5-year peace treaty, and he goes, oh no, that's horrible, that tastes like shipbuilding and pitch, like we're all going to be paranoid for an attack any minute. No, don't want that. Then he gets a little taste of the 10-year peace wine, and he goes, no, that tastes like diplomatic missions and playing for time. No, I don't like that. Until eventually he's given a glass of the delicious vintage 30 years of peace, and he goes, oh, that's lovely. I'll have an entire bottle of that. That tastes like being able to travel in Greece wherever I want to go. It tastes like not having to hear the word 3 days rations again. So the next year, in 424 BCE, when the Knights is performed, things have changed a little bit. So the previous year, when Aristophanes released the Acharnians, the war was not going Athens' way. They had been locked in this stalemate with Sparta, the treasury was much diminished, but later in the year 425, the Athenian general Demosthenes had daringly captured the fortress of Pylos, which had done two things. Firstly, Athens now had a base in the Spartan homeland. Sparta could no longer invade Athens annually with its whole army for fear that Athens could also strike into their territory. Secondly, during the battle for the harbour, over 100 Spartans had surrendered. Yeah, the Spartans surrendered. I know. This damaged the city's reputation massively. Spartans are ready to die at a moment's notice. They never give in. Right? Well, apparently not, and Sparta's credibility was greatly damaged by this. So, on the back foot and utterly humiliated, Sparta sues for peace, and Athens rejects that peace, largely thanks to old mate Cleon, who has got them all confident on their own victory, you know? So Aristophanes, seeing the war is now going the Athenian way a bit, understands that his pro-peace narrative might not strike the same heavy chord it did a year previously. So he switches themes slightly. In the Knights, he focuses more on the internal politics of Athens, but mostly it's about Cleon. In fact, the whole play is just a roast of Cleon, who would have certainly been in the audience to watch himself being ridiculed in front of the entire city, which is brilliant. So the characters of the play are real-life politicians who are all portrayed as slaves, and the chorus is their master, called Demos, meaning the people. Two of the slaves, Demosthenes and Nicias, who were also real politicians and would have also probably been in the audience, are despairing that their master, Demos, has been constantly manipulated by Cleon. Cleon has been sneaky his way into the master's good graces by falling at the master's feet, licking his boots, flattering and sucking up to him. He also says things like, "Why don't you just do one case today, and then have a good bath and a good meal on your 3 obols?" This is reference to an actual policy of Cleon's. So along with his aggressively pro-war and pro-expansionist policies, Cleon is famous for 2 major laws. The first one raised the phoros, the tribute which had to be paid by Athens's allies to the city, and the second one raised the pay for jurors to 3 obols a day. Now Aristophanes, amongst others, saw this as an obvious pandering for votes, by increasing the taxes of the class that didn't vote, that wasn't political, and increasing the handouts to the class that could vote for them, the Athenian citizens. But coming at it from another angle, this law could also be interpreted as being quite democratic and very anti-corruption. Prior to juror pay, only rich people could afford to spend all day sitting in court because they had big estates that basically ran themselves. A poor person could never be a juror because they'd go bankrupt, they needed to go to work. Over 100 years prior, this had been the case, and the rich had run an incredibly corrupt court system, which had helped lead to the many political crises of 6th century Athens. So maybe Aristophanes is being a bit unforgiving. The other big thing that Cleon was famous for was taking Spartans prisoner, which of course was a huge boost to his popularity. What a thing to do. But both Aristophanes and Thucydides think Cleon takes way too much credit for this. The actual idea for taking Pylos had been Demosthenes's, but Cleon had basically just gotten himself elected to command of the army when the battle was already won, so that he could take all of the glory. Aristophanes writes a great little allegory for this in the Knights. Demosthenes says that he's baked a great Spartan cake, which Cleon then stole and gave to the master, pretending he had baked it. Anyways, eventually a lowly sausage seller rises to beat Cleon at his own game. The sausage seller and Cleon do increasingly shameless and ridiculous things in an attempt to win the affection of the demos. The two of them are also always threatening each other with endless legal cases, because the Athenians think any problem can be solved in a courtroom, and Aristophanes loves mocking them for that. Anyways, the play ends, and Cleon is beaten, and the demos, and therefore the city of Athens, is much better off for it. And the people of Athens went wild for this play. They absolutely loved it. Aristophanes was given first prize and was praised to high heaven for his brilliant satire and his hilarious takedown of that no-good Cleon. And then the Athenian people turn around and continue to vote for Cleon. In fact, somewhat paradoxically, Cleon reaches the height of his power and influence around the same time that Aristophanes is receiving all this popular acclaim for mocking him. Which raises the question, if Aristophanes is writing these comedies about how inherently corrupt politics is, and how all these politicians are lying to the people, and everyone seems to be in on this joke and the comedy is very popular, does that mean people actually agree with Aristophanes? And if they do, why do they keep voting for Cleon when he's constantly telling them not to? Well, there are two main explanations for this. The first is that Aristophanes' plays weren't written for the regular people. So Cleon was a champion of the poor Athenian, and I do mean Athenian. He had no interest in pandering to the people who wouldn't be able to vote for him. But regardless, the everyman loved him. And like we mentioned earlier, what some people see as pandering for votes, other people see as genuine concern about social issues. Social issues that wouldn't be at the forefront of political discussion anywhere else in Greece, because democracy was the only system in which the regular person had any say in how their city was run. So maybe Aristophanes' main audience, the people who were going to see his plays, weren't the everyday people. Maybe his main audience was rich aristocrats, the ones who had always been skeptical of democracy, the ones who had lost the most in this war, and the ones that really didn't care for Cleon. This seems a bit too generous, however, because I find it hard to believe that Cleon was hyper-aware of social issues and genuinely looking out for the average Athenian while still doing all of this warmongering. In my opinion, the more likely explanation is that Aristophanes suffered from the curse of satire, that as soon as something is widespread enough that you can make jokes about it reliably to a mainstream audience, it's also too far out of your hands that you can solve it with comedy. Charlie Chaplin could not have made his excellent work of satire, The Great Dictator, at any other time other than when he did. If he had made it 10 years earlier, nobody would have understood his caricature of Hitler, because Hitler was not yet internationally recognized. But by the time the Nazis were embedded enough in the popular consciousness that you could make a popular comedy making fun of them, they were also too powerful to stop with jokes alone. It took 6 years of war instead. The great tragedy of satire is that if it's successful in getting laughs, it is entirely too late to stop with just jokes. And it might be that this is the case with the Knights. So skipping over the clouds and the wasps, because I don't want this video to be more than a year long, we arrive at peace. This is the final play that Aristophanes writes during this particular war, the Archidamian War. So the play starts with some slaves unhappily making buns out of dung to feed a giant dung beetle. One of the slaves just straight up breaks the fourth wall a mere 50 lines in, turning to the audience and saying, "I bet some clever clogs is already pointing out that the beetle is an allegory for Cleon, who is eating shit down with the dead right now." So this is essentially brilliant for two reasons. Firstly, it shows that even when theatre is basically in its youth, playwrights are already using their power to call people out on these kinds of behaviours. And secondly, because less than a year before this, Cleon fucking dies in battle. Aristophanes, who had no concept of too soon, does not hold back in relentlessly mocking his now dead rival, which just proves how much he fucking hated the guy. Anyways, so back to the plot. It turns out this beetle has been tamed by one Tragaius, who has slaves feeding it ready for a trip to go and meet the gods. Somewhat farcically, Tragaius announces that his intention is to prosecute Zeus for betraying Greece to the Mede. Hello, hello. That's another little bit of Aristophanes' personal philosophy right there. So in his previous play, The Clouds, which had been a huge flop, Aristophanes had already asserted his belief that the best Athenians were the ones who had fought the Persians, that there was kind of like a greatest generation feel about them, the men of Marathon. As far as he's concerned, the current war is petty squabbling between the Greeks over personal feuds and little revenge things, when in fact what they should be doing is teaming up to fight the real enemy, the Persians, the foreign invader, the barbarians. And so here he has a character calling the gods out for treason, because he's allowed the Greeks to descend into war amongst themselves, instead of preventing the Persians from ever becoming a threat again, which was of course the mission statement of Athens as empire. History is going to prove him right as well. In about 20 years, the Persians are going to exercise loads of power over a great deal of the Greeks because of this war. We also see a little bit more mockery of that Athenian attitude of everything can be solved in the courtroom. Tragaius actually thinks that he can take Zeus to court and prosecute him. So the rest of the play is a bit of a wild ride. Turns out the gods are done with the bickering and prayers of mankind and just want to live in peace, so they've fucked off. And only Hermes remains, and he's prepping the place for war, a new god who has recently imprisoned the goddess Peace, to move in permanently. War then arrives, annoyed that his two main warmongers, Cleon and Brasidas, are dead, and he needs new ones. Whilst he's away, Tragaius calls on all of the other Greeks to help him free Peace and her companions, Festival and Harvest. When she's trying to free them, the only useful Greeks are the farmers. The farmers, by the way, are the main victims of the war, and they're also kind of representative of Aristophanes imagining a better, purer, old, long-gone golden age, a better time when everyone just farmed and didn't fight so much. Peace is reluctant to go back to the Greeks because she reveals that she originally went away because the Athenians kept on voting against her, on account of the fact that the politicians were all profiting greatly from the war. Anyways, so they free Peace, Trygaeus marries Harvest, and Festival returns with them to Athens so she can throw a great big party. Trygaeus even ends up coming up with a list of useful things that they can use war material for now. In 421, when Aristophanes writes this play, he's probably around 25 years old. And here's a basic overview of his life so far. First 15 years of his childhood. Athens is the wealthiest, most prosperous city in Greece. And being a child, Aristophanes would have known nothing other than how brilliant that was. And for the last 10 years, and his entire adult life, Aristophanes has watched the state he lives in decline. The treasury is empty after years of war. Athens no longer has as much control over her allies as she did beforehand, and Athenian politics has become more divisive and more demagogy. But, unlike his other two plays, which despite being popular, obviously don't reflect the views and opinions of everyone in Athens, this one seems to kind of do that. As he brings up in the play, Cleon and the Spartan, Brasidas, both died, and both of them were the most hawkish advocates for war in their respective cities. So now that these guys were dead, Athens and Sparta could do a stocktake, realize how much they'd actually lost in the last 10 years, and decide that it was time to end all of this. So, less than 2 weeks after the peace is performed, Athens signs a 50-year peace treaty with Sparta, and the Archidamian War is brought to an end. I hope this has put Aristophanes' early comedies in a bit of context for you, because the father of comedy really is worth reading. This won't be the last video on him though. I'm planning on doing a follow-up one to cover plays like The Birds and Lysistrata, because Aristophanes' career does not end here. Come to think of it, the war doesn't end here either. There's a reason we don't call it the 10-year-long Archidamian War, we actually call it the 30-year-long Peloponnesian War, because that 50-year peace, not going to last 50 years. Barely going to make it 5 years, actually. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.